Let's look at commas. Commas are not random, and we don't need to be guessing where they go. Everything in language has a reason behind it, and the reason that we place commas has a lot to do with how we structure our sentence. The purpose of a comma is not the purpose of a comma is really to separate the parts of a sentence. So let's look at building a sentence. So a sentence is made, or a sentence can be made, I should say, of 4 different parts. For now, I'm going to forget kind of the tricky terms for these parts. I'm just going to call them for what they are. So let's look at this first sentence. It says, after much thought, Andy Smith, a bright student from New York, decided it was time to leave the big city to chase his dream of becoming a farmer. So what they say is that there are actually 4 parts in that sentence. There's main parts, lead-in parts, in-between parts, and add-on parts. And again, you may have heard teachers use tricky terms for those, things like independent clauses, subordinate clauses, things like that. For now, I just want you to think of main parts, lead-in parts, in-between parts, and add-on parts. So the main parts, this is the main action of the sentence. It must contain a subject and an action word, which is called a verb. So we have a subject, which is a noun, and a verb, which is an action word. And it could be a sentence on its own. So if we're looking at our sentence here about Andy Smith, there's actually a main part here. And it is Andy Smith decided it was time to leave the big city. That's actually the main part of the sentence. Here it's been split, and you're going to see how that works. But there's always a main part in a sentence. It's the part of the sentence that could really stand on its own. There's also lead-in parts. So this part, as it says, is going to lead into another part, usually a main part. Think of these as almost setting the stage for the sentence. And in this case, it's after much thought. So it's a lead-in part. It's giving a little bit of context to that sentence. And notice that at the end of each part, there is a comma. These commas are separating the parts of the sentence, breaking it up so that the reader can process what you're talking about. There's also what's called an in-between part. So these parts go between the other parts of a sentence and they add information. They usually feel like a bit of an interruption. So in this case, it's a bright student from New York in the example. So it's going to feel like a bit of an interruption. And it goes in between other parts. So here, feel this interruption. Andy Smith, a bright student from New York, decided it was time to leave the big city. It's kind of an interruption. I sometimes see students try and do this. They try to put it in brackets. Andy Smith, a bright student from New York, decided it was time to leave the big city. We recognize that it's an in-between part, but it's not correct to simply put it in brackets. It's actually part of the sentence. And sometimes I like to think of these in-between parts as things that could be whispered, right? Andy Smith, a bright student from New York, decided it was time to leave the big city. I could leave it out completely, and the sentence would still make sense. But it's adding richness and detail to my sentence. So we call this an in-between part. And lastly, we have what's called an add-on part. These give more information on the other parts, and they usually come at the end after a main part. So in this case, to chase the dream of becoming a farmer, it's added on to the end of a sentence. Let's look at the sentence here. After much thought, I'll highlight it here. Here's our add-on. After much thought, Andy Smith, a bright student from New York, decided it was time to leave the big city to chase his dream of becoming a farmer. I could leave this part out, but it's been added on, and it's adding detail to my sentence. So again, after we see our example here once again. So here's another example. Here it is without the proper punctuation. Later, when I was done work, I went home. I'll read it again. Later, when I was done work, I went home. I'm reading it exactly as written. But let's identify the main part first. So the main part could be a complete sentence that stands on its own. I went home. We see it here. We also have a bit of an in-between part. When I was done work. It's kind of an interruption. And we have a lead-in part, later. So when I identify each of these parts, I can see the full sentence. Later, comma, when I was done work, comma, I went home. Intro part, in-between part, main part. And they're separated by commas. So now I'll read it back with the commas. Later, when I was done work, I went home. It makes a lot more sense. Those pauses allow the reader to really understand what you are saying, and it breaks that sentence up properly, not just randomly, or not just, sometimes people say put a comma, whenever you feel like you should take a little breath in the sentence. Well, that doesn't really make sense. Really, it's about separating these parts. So here's another example of a rich sentence building using commas to add detail and interest. So here's the main part. Michael was tired, period. It's a perfectly grammatically correct sentence, but it's not very rich. There's not a lot of detail there. Let's see if we can add some more. Here's the next version. After working all night long, Michael was tired. There's that comma. So we have an intro part and a main part. Here's a really long one, or a really detailed one, I should say. After working all night long, Michael, who normally loves staying up all night, was tired. So here I have a split main part. So here's the main part. Michael was tired, and it's been split by this in-between part. So I could leave that part out, but I'm going to whisper it here so you can see how it would make sense. Michael, who normally loves staying up all night, was tired, right? So by using these commas, I'm able to create a more rich sentence. After working all night long, Michael, who normally loves staying up all night, was tired. Let's look at another one here. See if I can go a little bit further. After working all night long, Michael, who normally loves staying up all night, was tired. So he went to bed as quickly as he could. This is a very rich multi-part sentence, and it's about as long as I would want to make a sentence. If I started adding more, I'm going to get what's called a run-on. Let's look at my run-on. After working all night long, Michael, who normally loves staying up all night, was tired, so he went to bed as quickly as he could, until he realized he couldn't find his pillow. So he looked around the room for it, but could not find it. If you find yourself in a run-on, like that, break it up. Here we go. After working all night long, Michael, who normally loves staying up all night, was tired, so he went to bed as quickly as he could. As he got ready, he realized he couldn't find his pillow. He looked around the room for it, but could not find it. Now, you'll notice in that sentence, there's a little blue underline. I'm in my Microsoft Word here, so I have my little grammar check running. You'll see a blue underline, which means there's something a little bit wrong. So notice that but in the last sentence has a blue underline grammar error. This is because we generally don't place commas in front of conjunctions. So unless what follows is what's called an independent clause. So an independent clause is basically something that would act as a full sentence. So notice up here, if I went but, he could not find it, the grammar error goes away, because this he could not find it, that's an independent clause. It's an idea that could stand on its own. Okay? Conjunctions are the parts of speech that join sentences together, such as but, because, and or. Watch out for commas and conjunctions, as they are among the most common comma errors. So again, here's the corrected version of that last sentence. He looked around the room for it, but could not find it, right? If I wanted to change that, I could say, comma, but he could not find it. So that would be an independent clause. And you'll notice no grammar error there. If I remove the he, there's my grammar error, right? But totally fine just like this. In fact, I think that's a little bit more clear. He looked around the room for it, but could not find it. So the comma when you really think about it, we've looked at these examples, really signals the differentiation between two independent clauses, or what could be considered full sentences. The second independent clause might have what's called a coordinating conjunction in it, words like and, but, or, nor, for, yet, and so. It might look something like this. I really need to go to the store, or we won't have cereal for breakfast. So there's my coordinating conjunction. And notice these are two independent sentences. I really need to go to the store. We won't have cereal for breakfast. Each of those could stand on their own, but there's what's called a coordinating conjunction here that really helps the sentence to be joined together. There's also that comma though. I want to go down the water slide, but I want to make sure we are home in time for dinner. There's a coordinating conjunction here, but, right? And it joins these sentences together. It shows their relationship, and they're separated by that comma. Okay? So notice the second half of these sentences after the comma, it could be considered a full sentence on its own. I've chosen to leave them together in the sentence because they're so closely related. It's a choice that I'm making as a writer. I've done this by adding a coordinating conjunction. Without it, you'll end up with something called a comma splice. A comma splice is when two complete sentences are separated by a comma when perhaps there simply should have been a period or a conjunction. So here's an example of a comma splice. Michael was at the store, comma, he was looking for bread. It's a comma splice. It should be split up. Michael was at the store, period. He was looking for bread. But we could also use a semicolon since those ideas are so closely related. Michael was at the store. He was looking for bread. Semicolons are a topic for a different video. I'm not trying to complicate this. I'm just trying to show that there are different ways of kind of playing with your sentences to try to get them to do what you want them to do. So the best way, I think, in this case to correct this comma splice is with a conjunction. Michael was at the store and he was looking for bread. There's my conjunction. I have my comma before it. The reason I have the comma is because there's an independent clause, a sentence that could stand on its own there. So I will add, though, sometimes rewording the sentence is better. So remember that because our goal is to communicate clearly, sometimes simple, and think about this in your writing, simple is sometimes better than complicated. So here we go. Michael was at the store looking for bread. I really don't have to play with that there, right? I don't have to make any changes. Michael was at the store looking for bread. There's my full sentence. I'm not playing with conjunctions. I'm not trying to run a semicolon through it. What was going on? Michael was at the store looking for bread. Sometimes simple is better than complicated. Make a note that you basically never put a comma before the word because or other similar words. These are called subordinating conjunctions. This means the word connects a clause to the main part of the sentence that wouldn't make any sense if it were separated. For example, I went to the store because I needed bread. If the sentence were just, I needed bread, the reader wouldn't understand necessarily that what the reason was that I went to the store. The two things could have been unrelated if they were in separate sentences. There is a longer list of subordinating conjunctions. They include words like after, although, as if, before, by the time, even if, and more. Like there's lots of these subordinating conjunctions that can be put into a sentence. So hopefully this is, I know it's a lot of information on the commas, and I'll readily admit sometimes I even make mistakes with my comma usage. But it's always good and helpful to take a fresh look at your comma usage. Remember, really the best way to catch your errors in your writing is to read what you wrote back to yourself out loud and pay attention to those parts of a sentence, those lead-in parts, those in-between parts, those main parts, and those add-on parts, and start reading for them. Start looking for them. When you're doing if you're reading a book or a newspaper article, if you're reading something on the internet, look for those parts of a sentence and see if the writer has placed a comma, and then start looking for it in your own writing.